kind of give you a feeling for what's going to happen with all of these people that are coming up here. They're going to be reading 4 different readings from Unitarian voices, plus a time for your reflection on their ideas. The following is an excerpt from an address entitled "A Discourse to Commemorate the Rendition of Thomas Sims." And this was given by Theodore Parker, April 12, 1852, during the great controversy over passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. When Thomas Sims was unlawfully seized and detained in custody against the law, the governor of Massachusetts was in Boston. The legislature was in session. It seems to me that it was their duty to protect the man, to enforce the laws of the state, but they did no such thing. There was in Boston a large number of crafty, rich, designing, and respectable men who wanted a man kidnapped in Boston and sent into slavery. They wanted that for the basest of purposes, for the sake of money. They wanted the name of it, the reputation of kidnapping a man. They protected the kidnappers, foreign and domestic, egged them on, feasted them. It's been said that 1,500 men volunteered to escort their victim out of the state, that some of them are rich men. I think the majority of the middle class of men were in favor of freedom. But in Boston, what is a man without money? And if he has money, who cares how base his character may be? You demand moral character only of a clergyman. Some of the richest men were strongly in favor of freedom, but alas, not many, and for the most part, they were silent.
Theodore Parker today is considered to be one of the very leading lights in the history of Unitarian Universalist thought, but it was not always this way. Early in his preaching career, Parker created controversy, earned infamy, by openly questioning the relevance of the Christian tradition and of the Bible itself. This was at a time when Unitarianism still considered itself to be a branch of Christian thinking, and which routinely turned to the Bible and theistic concepts in its teachings. As a result of his provocative sermons, Parker was excluded from pulpits, even Unitarian pulpits, throughout the Boston area where he lived at the time. And in some ways, the controversy drove the American Unitarian Association to adopt a creed, albeit a liberal creed, in order to define itself in contrast to Parker's vision. Nonetheless, Parker persisted in speaking his truth and in gathering congregations of fellow thinkers to his side. The discord between Parker and the Unitarian establishment was not limited solely to philosophical matters about what Unitarianism meant or stood for. Parker, as a minister, was outspoken in his opposition to slavery and in support of the abolitionist movement that was gaining steam in part because after the Mexican War in the 1840s, Congress took a number of actions, including the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, to paper over differences between free and slave states. The act required officials in all states, free or slave, to actively assist in the capture and return of fugitive slaves to their purported owners. This predictably caused outrage among many in the North to consider that their local officials would be conscripted into this effort. This was the context behind Parker's words, which we heard a moment ago. Thomas Sims was captured on the streets of Boston, imprisoned, and ultimately sent to slavery. It was an outrage which Parker could not abide. It is perhaps next to impossible for Americans today to comprehend what it may have been like to live in a country where millions of Americans of African heritage were enslaved from birth to death, generation after generation, subjected to forced labor, cruel punishment, sexual assault, and degradation of every character, every day. American chattel slavery was one of history's most vile expressions of white supremacy. particularly offensive when it occurred in a nation purportedly committed to the concepts of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is mind-boggling to imagine the courage that people like Parker and his contemporaries must have exhibited in order to so publicly condemn a system of thought and action which, even in his own day, had been rooted in this society for centuries, and to do so in the face of opposition from his own fellow Unitarians. And yet he did, and he is inspirational to us today, in no small part for this reason. Personally, I am reminded of Parker's understanding of this crisis because, in a way, we are experiencing a faint echo of the same phenomenon today regarding transgender Americans. In state after state, legislators in recent years have rushed to enact laws which restrict what bathrooms transgender people may use, what sports teams, if any, they may participate in, what changes, if any, they may make to their identity documents, and what forms of medical treatment they may or may not seek. All of these laws are currently forcing transgender people and their families to consider the need to flee from these states into states like Minnesota, which have set themselves up as sanctuaries for refugees coming from other parts of our own country to avoid the injustice of other states' laws. And in less than a month, the nation will be governed by an administration purportedly committed to enacting some of these same restrictions at the federal level, potentially affecting us all. Like Parker, we too may see our local authorities in Minnesota compelled to act as agents of oppression. To be clear, I am not suggesting that the crisis facing many transgender Americans in the 21st century is the equivalent of the plight faced by African Americans in the 19th. But I am suggesting that when the law is such that it forces people to cross state lines against their will, there is something wrong with the law. Theodore Parker died in the spring of 1860, and so he never saw the Civil War or the ultimate triumph of abolition. While he may have been disappointed not to see the end of slavery in the United States, Parker clearly took the long view of history. One of his most famous declarations was one he would have likely been proud to see adapted into the more usable language of the 20th century by Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., a statement we have been hearing a lot of since November 5th. What Parker originally said, in the more complicated language of 1853, was this: "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends toward justice." Let us, in our day, be like Parker in helping make it so. The question for us today is, what practices can we adopt to help us take that long view, to hold on to that arc, and to do the bending?
The Reverend John Dietrich delivered a talk called Grounds for Hope in the Present Chaos on March 27, 1932, which was at the peak of the Great Depression. Here's an excerpt. "I find in the restlessness of these times a basis of hope, not because of the restlessness itself, but because of what it means, the welling up in the human consciousness everywhere of a new life that demands a fuller and freer expression. The quiet, peaceful, and prosperous times have never been periods of real progress. It's in the stir and ferment of the restless ages which will not permit us to be lulled into complacent slumber that the best and highest of us in us is called forth. How has the world survived to this present time, if not by the virtue of the fact that underneath every great deluge, which has swept away the proud civilization of the past, seeds of life have survived and thus produced a succeeding and better age? Seeds of life have survived? Where? in the hearts of people who've refused to be dismayed, who've kept faith in the dark hours of disaster, who have heroically insisted on serving the best that they knew, even when such service seemed most futile. In the midst of every civilization that has died and rotted, there have been living, certain, chosen spirits who valiantly held aloft the banner of faith and hope and goodwill. And through these spirits, mankind has risen again in glory. In our hearts must germinate those seeds of a new and better conception of human life, which may survive the deluge that impends.
So a few years ago, I had the privilege of reading most of John Dietrich's talks for a database that we created for Meadville Lombard that's also available on our website. George Green has scanned all of his talks, among others. So I have been able to really understand and love the words that Dietrich shared with people more than 100 years ago. He was talking early on about birth control. He was talking about the fact that not only should women have the right to vote, but we need more women in politics. He was also well ahead of his time on talking about the fact that we tend to turn to punishment for crime without recognizing human psychology requires something different, which is treatment and other things, compassion. So he talked about all of those things. And at the time that he gave this address in 1932, 1 in 4 Americans did not have work. Nearly 9,000 banks had failed. And it was also the time that the Nazi Party was starting to rise politically in Germany under Adolf Hitler. Dietrich, in fact, had gone to Germany around this time and started to see some of that himself and talked quite a bit about it here. Yet he also talked about these seeds of life, even in the difficult time between the Great Depression and the Second World War. And indeed, the year that he delivered this talk, we had our first woman elected to the U.S. Senate from Arkansas. She beat 2 male opponents in 1932. It was also the same year Amelia Earhart became the first woman to fly nonstop and solo across the Atlantic Ocean, giving us all a little seed of hope for what the future might have. It was also later that year when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected in a landslide, who of course set up a lot of what was able to transpire over the following decades through public policies. So again, Dietrich's message was, even in these darkest times, we are all able to bring seeds of life. I will be here in a couple weeks with some women in their 20s who have written essays for the Minnesota Women's Press that I edit, and they will be talking about where they're finding their own seeds to plant this coming year. So I just would ask that people take a moment today to think and reflect to yourself about what seeds you will plant in 2025.
Speaking here on October 1st, 1961, Carl Storm said this: "Just recently, the New York Times reported on the opening of the 7th Annual Convention of the organization We the People, being held in Chicago. The major speaker at We the People convention was Robert Welsh, who, dwelling upon one of his major themes, told his audience that democracy is probably the worst of all possible governments, that democracy leads to mobocracy. That was palatable meat for the convention of We the People. We the People, assuming themselves to be the select elite who will determine and enforce the laws, divine, natural, and otherwise. Dressed in the guise of anti-communism, it has all the earmarks of neo-fascism. No one who experienced the McCarthy period can dare to underrate the potential of a resurgent McCarthyism. There are, however, three aspects which are hopefully different in the present situation. One is the glare of publicity that has so quickly and so widely been turned upon the John Birch Society. Second, the John Birch Society has so far at least been unable to tie in with a personality leader, and more particularly with a personality leader in a position of political office and political power. Third, along with the resurgence of McCarthyism, there's indicated a countering revival of liberalism and respectable conservatism.
Ten years after we moved into this building, Carl Storm, our minister, spoke to us. This was 1961, and his group, as he knew it, were very familiar with McCarthyism, that whole morass that rose in the 50s. But he was making them aware of a new fascistic movement, and I think you can hear in what he lays out in that sermon just the clues you need to size up our current situation. In that sermon, he described secrecy in the leadership, one controlling figure, Robert B. Welch, who moved through different organizations secretly. You recognize the populist appeal of this group. They posed as absolutely right. They were patriotic people. The names of their groups were Christian Crusade, We the People, and the John Birch Society. They claimed enemies, perennially socialists and communists, which were the same thing, of course. And their claims and accusations were outlandish. The outlandishness, I'm not sure why, but it seemed to pull in popular appeal. They claimed that Eisenhower was a commie operative, and his brother was directing him. Carl Storm always spoke sermons that were educational and empowering. And I think here in this 1961 sermon, he does it again. He tells you all the facts you need to know, and then he lets you make the decisions, trusting that informed, you will hold to your values.
"2001 was not a positive year. The U.S. had inaugurated its first president elected by hanging chads. Said president announced his disinterest in the Kyoto Accords by March, rejecting the first international commitment to global climate goals. And my son lost his passport in Japan that summer. Many here in this room may remember the morning of September 11th, 2001. Here in Minnesota, it was a beautiful morning. As I was leaving for work, I deliberately turned off the radio because I didn't want any of that world interfering with the beauty that I was driving through. But by the time I came out of my first class teaching at St. Kate's that morning, I learned that the World Trade Towers, the Pentagon, and a field in Pennsylvania had seen the deaths of nearly 3,000 Americans by terrorist attacks. We remember the intense Islamophobia and its extension to everyone from West Asia, including people in this room. The Patriot Act soon followed. We've never traveled the same since then. Ultimately, the US invaded Iraq based on false information, and the America First movement cohered through the evolving internet. Our own Reverend Dr. Kendyl Gibbons conducted a service of remembrance on September 16, 2001. She named no names or any countries in that entire service. Instead, she focused on the discipline of light. You'll now hear from Adele about this list of commitments that could strengthen our defense against becoming just like those we label enemies. Adele?
This is an editing from throughout Kendyl's sermon entitled The Disciplines of Light, a Service of Remembrance. How can we, as we attempt to cope, to understand, how can we try not to become that which we struggle against? I think we keep ourselves from this by striving to stay true to the disciplines of light. The first thing is connection. As human beings, we are connected to each other, each and every one. The second is freedom, that every person has a right to their opinions, their work, their happiness, their choices, their life. The human society that makes our lives meaningful and gives us wisdom and comfort and happiness is utterly dependent upon trust, the third discipline of life, of light. The love of mercy is the fourth. Even when connection fails, when freedom and trust are vanquished, we are called upon to love mercy, to take pity on suffering, and to use our powers to heal wounds and to mend brokenness. Finally, the disciplines of life include an ongoing commitment to the possibility of peace. The disciplines of light are easy when the light is everywhere. To love mercy is easy when there's no costly loss to account. To keep connection is easy with those whose differences from ourselves are neither profound nor challenging. Trust comes readily to the privileged who've never been betrayed. The freedom whose opposite is slavery is easy to choose. The freedom whose opposite is safety and control is less alluring. To pledge oneself to peace in the abstract requires only sentiment. To pledge oneself to peace as an alternative to present anger and righteous vengeance is to choose that value over some of the most powerful impulses of our evolutionary heritage, fear and rage.
This week, as Project 2025 looms, a voter mandate of 1.6% declares that liberals are now the enemy within. We face censorship of real information, an even greater deluge of misinformation, mass deportations, and further defilements of civil liberties. We face divisions between neighbors, families, and colleagues. We are now all challenged to consider Kendyl's discipline of light. How can each of us, individually and collectively, navigate a new order in which Michelle Obama's mantra, "When they go low, we go high," can keep us on our path?